Hi there. I do apologize in advance. I haven't really been feeling the best, so sorry if my voice is a little out of it. I have some horrible sinus stuff going on. I've just been very tired and kind of groggy, so bear with me if I start sniffling a little. But I wanted to reflect this week on homework 5. Like I said, I can't believe we're already in homework 5, and midterms week was crazy for me. So, but exciting at the same time. Um, but I felt really inspired by this lecture, and it makes me happy to say that because I think I've shared with you in the past how I think after the lecture, sometimes I feel like very cynical and negative about the world that we live in. And so I feel that this particular lecture, I really loved like the little bit of banter and kind of collaboration with you and your husband. I thought it was really fun to see, but I also just really loved sharing his perspective. And I can see why like you talk so highly of him because he's a really smart dude. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about homework 5 and what some of those prompts were from the videos that you shared with us. And then in my next video, as always, I'll talk a little bit about the reading and what some of my real life takeaways were with that. So starting with the first video, you wanted us to elaborate on how does phenomenology show us the possible way in which the good or ethics is shared rather than isolated and individual? And how does Frutina the Unicorno, which I thought was super cute, a cute little illustration, how does Unicorno help illustrate this fact? So a couple of my takeaways from that, I thought it was actually really interesting, the idea of how goods appear to begin with, and that publicity of the world is very fundamental. There's multiple different perspectives on goods, and my perspective on it has that ripple effect and has impact on other people and the people around me, but near and far. And so it would be kind of crazy to say that inherently things can be private because we're a pluralistic public society. There's really no such thing as goods being completely private. I really loved, I wrote down here that it would be insane to say that they're isolated because perspective is not equal. So when it comes to Unicorno, this idea of looking at things and kind of like being within and without all at the same time, that binary concept I really loved, being present and absent. We're able to experience things from the front side of things, but when we're doing that, there's also experiencing it from the back side. So having multiple perspectives and that ripple effect shows that it's really impossible to have something that's completely isolated because things are so binary, that presence and absence. Perspective is not equal, which is how objectivism kind of exists. And in an APC community, it can't just be about what I think or what we think, this majority rules. We need that phenomenological work. Can we be open? Can we do the good work? What else needs to be done? So for the second video, we talked about some voting rights and what the concerns are regarding voting itself, as well as voting rights from an APC perspective. Why is size an issue for APC as well? That is, why do we only want a small scale society? And I wrote down some really interesting things about this. So when it comes to voting rights, and this idea of like, well, how do we legislate when there really is no legislature or anything to regulate, right? There's no constitution, there's no set of rules or guidelines. So why do we vote? How do we vote? Do we even vote at all? So this idea that voting in itself is really immoral. And I had the longest conversation yesterday about this with one of my, he's very, very, very liberal, but he came over for the Super Bowl. And I brought this up and I was like, well, Matt, if you think of this, like we're all kind of like submitting to the system that we don't really even understand what it is we're submitting to. And I, like I said, he's really liberal, but I talked about this idea of how voting is actually like how these isms and like racism and like white supremacy and privilege and like discriminatory acts like really come to be. And this idea that like we're giving one person sole control, which for the past 4 years was Trump, which is terrifying, but like having one person have the responsibility and the pressure that we've been like, hey, yeah, we're cool with it. You're going to speak on behalf of millions of people. It's just so crazy. And I've never thought of it that way. And it's not to say that like I'm anti the system, but when you think about the actual system that you're condoning, it is really interesting. So I'm going to take a little break. 1 second. So this idea that voting is immoral and that you're just giving this thumbs up to the system, and that the empire is actually doing more harm than good. The U.S. being on the forefront of all of these isms, and I do think that it's an unintentional thing. I don't even think it's something that we're really aware of, but I loved how APC felt that we should be playing a different game, that there's a new conversation that we could be having, something that could maybe benefit more people than just a certain select group, and having one person represent the majority. How can you possibly say that the majority benefits everybody? Because honestly, usually it doesn't. There's always people who aren't benefiting from it. And so having a new conversation, having one person controlling the game is just something that's really deemed as immoral in APC communities. And I should be running my ship. How can one person represent another person, even if they do have good intentions? So putting this pressure, and like I said, we're almost condoning it. We are condoning it and saying you have the right to speak on my behalf, is really kind of an interesting thing and not really something that I think a lot of people take into consideration. So voting is the most anti-communal idea that we can have in APC. Voting is secretive, not conversational, which is an interesting thought as well, because even though people talk about maybe who they're voting for, the fact that we're not really talking about, well, should we even vote? Should we even have somebody who's in charge of the entire country and speaking on everyone's behalf? And that's, again, something that different conversation maybe we should be having. I also wrote something down I thought was really interesting, but we don't all have an impact and have a say in the votes. Don't the outcomes and topics affect everyone? Representative democracy isn't truly democracy of any kind. So being forced into this idea of representative democracy and voting is something that we've kind of been forced into by size. And APC, in terms of size and, wanting small scale society, like that 5,000 mark, maybe even like the 3,000 to 5,000 mark, if that could exist. Unfortunately, because our society is so large and it's so screwed up in like a lot of ways, true APC or true anarchy really couldn't exist, because we live in a society that doesn't care, doesn't value, surely doesn't value the individual. And it really only prioritizes the majority. And usually the majority are the people who can, condone the system, pay into capitalism, make the government more money, can pay higher taxes, things like that. So the next question I wanted to dive into was from video 3. And it was, how is Hugo Chavez fighting against liberal politics? Why was the Bolivarian Revolution non-liberal and different from other communist and socialist revolutions? This is something that I wrote so many notes about, so I won't really go into all of it. But my takeaways from this, I think it's insane that, and I don't think it's just Venezuela. I think the US has their hands in a lot of different societies, and a lot of it is tied in the Middle East because of oil. A lot of it's tied in places like Venezuela. And I think in countries where we're not welcome and it's made known that we're not welcome, I think those tend to become the enemies of the US and seen as a threat. So to me, this idea that Hugo Chavez went in and literally used the system, even though he didn't condone the system and wanted to dismantle the system and say, we don't want your hand in our politics. I want to give the power back to the people. He actually used the very system to get in, dismantle it from the inside out, and give the power back to the people and establish some of these communes that still exist. And I loved, and again, last night I talked to my liberal friend Matt. We'll call him Liberal Matt instead of Liberal Dan, but Liberal Matt. He's like one of the biggest Democrats I've ever met in my life. He's like very pro-socialism. I wouldn't say he's a socialist, but he's very like pro-socialist ideas, like would totally move to Norway if he could, that kind of guy. And I respect that, we have a lot of differences on how we think about things, but I talked to him a little bit about this, and he knew a little bit about that Bolivarian revolution. And so we talked a lot about how Chavez actually traded free oil in exchange to have doctors from Cuba, which have some of the best doctors in the world, if not the best doctors in the world, to come in and be able to bring a doctor into these communes who could have relationships with the people, and the people in the communities could be cared for and valued and be taken care of. And being able to give that power and that care back to people is like a really positive thing. And I think APC is like really all for like, I want to be part of a community that values me, that knows me, that cares about me, and is in my corner and is going to make decisions that positively affect me and benefit me. So I really, really loved that. The need for these communes and participatory democracy, not elected officials, but that things are decided collectively. And I think Hugo Chavez brought in a lot of really great qualities. And it is a bummer that he died of cancer. That's very, very sad. So this idea, full control of their life, having full control over their life, giving the power of the government back to the people to bring true value and freedom to the people. And to me, that was my biggest takeaway. And I really loved that. I thought that was very positive. So for the last two videos, video 4 and 5, I just want to talk a little bit about currency, how it came about, how our society is definitely predicated on debt. I talk about that with my husband all the time. And then also I just want to dive into Liberal Dan and some of his thoughts and counter arguments on APC. So this origin of debt, originally, obviously, coins, Greek origin, yada, yada, yada. But moving more into modern currency and how it originated in England, I thought that was really interesting. I think a lot of things about our society in general, especially in the United States, has actually been derived from England. And it's an interesting thing. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But this idea that, what was his name? King William. King William created the Bank of England and essentially needed to borrow money as an IOU. And I'm like, oh, well, doesn't that sound really familiar? That's like every credit card user ever, right? I should say most of them, not everybody borrows to be in debt, but most people who have credit cards borrow because they want to be able to buy things with money that they don't have. So this idea that our economy has literally been structured, I feel like everything, not just about our economy, but like about our government too, is totally structured on this idea of you owe me. And I think that they like knowing that we owe them things. So it's really interesting that you talked about your credit score going down. I had the hardest time when I first bought a car because I didn't have any credit. And my mom's like, well, you need to go get a credit card. You need to start, making payments, blah, 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 and establish your credit. And I'm like, but why do I have to go get in debt and take money out and owe the government money now just to be able to get a car? Shouldn't I just be able to get a car if I want a car? Like, I need to go to work. I'm 16. I don't want to get a credit card. So that idea to me is just like, it's so embedded and deep rooted in capitalism and what our society looks like. It's just so crazy. And like, like they're like vultures, and I feel like they know that we need their money, but they don't even have the money to give us, so they just keep borrowing money from other countries. So it's just like this weird like power, like you owe us, but it's like, okay, but you owe people too. So I don't know, it was really interesting. So this idea of bartering from good to good, the business owners, the top 1%, the man, right? So capitalism has this hunger and this pursuit, and I wrote down hunger of money. And in APC, I really love that there was really no bartering. And you talked a little bit about, and I want to see where I wrote down because I want to get it just right. Native Americans only bartered with non-essential goods and with people that they didn't know. So in APC, there's no need for bartering. There's no need to borrow or exchange if you care about somebody, if you know someone, if you value them. Um, uh, I also wrote down here that we cannot have true relationality with money. And this is why that capitalism isn't good and doesn't work. Money is useless and meaningful in relationships. So if you equate that back to APC, APC is all about value and relationship. So how can we truly have value in relationship when we're motivated by money? What can you do for me? What I have to pay you for you to do something for me? And it takes the human element out of doing something out of the kindness of your heart because you know it's going to help somebody or benefit somebody. It now becomes an exchange. I give you something, you give me something, and vice versa. And in APC, that's not what it's all about. And so this idea that we only need economics in a society that you don't know or don't trust people. And that is exactly what our country is. So it makes sense. But it is really sad. But APC being this idea of like anti-economic, this notion of debt, that what is owed or indebted to someone is actually a lack of care and familiarity. And I loved that. And I highlighted it a bunch because I thought that that was very, very important. Even ethical indebtedness with strangers, this idea of I owe you this because you did something for me, is very problematic and anti-moral in itself. I also wrote something else down, problems with communism. Land is not something that you can own, reduces subjects into objects. And this is the problem with communism and other socialist ideas and kind of how the two differ. And that you can't really own anything when money doesn't exist. We all own everything. We truly own everything. So I just wanted to note that little bit of difference. This idea, is Jesus really against money? Is Jesus against charity? A couple things that you had noted that I thought were really interesting. To have trust is to truly have faith in something and not believe in the magical, mystical, could this have happened? It's more, I believe in the good of this, and I believe that that's worth living for. And as a Christian, I can definitely respect that value and appreciate that. Jesus overturned the money changers' tables. This idea that Jesus was telling, like, do not bow down to Caesar, the man, don't have faith in the system, and that it actually goes against the Christ-like values of the church. I thought was really interesting. I'd never really thought of it that way. And also this temptation to bow down to Satan, where Jesus rejects the system and completely just like rejects politics and humanity, I feel like. And that that's not how we're supposed to live or take care of one another, and that we always need to find a way. And if we don't have a way, we need to create a way and find a way to make sure that we can always take care of somebody. If they're hungry, if they're sick, this is our community. We care about them. He never called on a system or institution to fix it. And I wrote down, money and welfare won't solve our problems. Very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. And so last, I just wanted to touch on Liberal Dan. I think that was the last question on here. What are some of Liberal Dan's, which is your alter ego, arguments against APC? So a couple of his counter arguments is that isolation is non or subjective. Pain is experienced very differently. It's dangerous to not have individual rights. It's taking a huge leap of faith. I think that it can work in some societies. I do agree with that. I think if we could go back in time, I think we could have made it work probably more on a I don't want to say large scale because the whole point is for it to not be large scale, but in more than just like 1,000 communes, maybe we could have had more than that, but to go back and rewind would obviously not be something that we could do. But this idea that in a revolution, even if we were to like completely overthrow, not everybody would be interested in doing that. Not everyone would be on board or okay with not having rules, not having that safety net, having full trust in other people who there's no guarantee that they wouldn't harm you because they don't know you. And in APC, it's really big on like, well, your community knows you, but to go from a community where nobody knows you, sorry, I'm out of frame, a huge community where nobody knows you to a small community where you feel like everyone does, how do you narrow that down? How do we create those small communities out of this giant mass hysteria that is the US? I also highlighted trust that people won't hurt you just probably isn't the case. People aren't ever really going to be okay with that or feel that. And one thing I felt was the most important, I highlighted it a bunch, plural society, that we live in a plural society. APC only works if everyone agrees. We must separate the public from the private. We must choose an institution that maximizes individual freedom since no one will ever 100% agree. And that's just not the case in the United States. This idea of liberalism being potentially the most fair institution that we have access to, I think might be the greatest counter argument for APC. Probably won't catch fire. Why? How do we undo multiculturalism in our country? How do we undo pluralism? How do we universalize something when our society is so plural and everyone feels that my truth and what's best for me is my truth? That's the way, that's the best way for me to live. So liberalism offers the most choice and flexibility. APC does think that pluralism is bad, however, and that we should have a singular society, and it's just almost humanly impossible in this country to revert and have a single society when we have such a multicultural spectrum and broad, even just where I live, array of different views, different beliefs, different morals, different ways of seeing life, different ways of viewing money. So to have everyone have a singular focus probably just isn't possible. So in the next video, I just want to summarize the gift of democracy and talk a little bit about some separation of power and dive into the reading a little bit. And then I will wrap up my final thoughts.